Hey everyone, welcome to my channel from start to now. If you love uncovering hidden stories from history, you're in the right place. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss our future videos. Let's dive in. Imagine standing on a tropical beach, thousands of islands stretching to the horizon, thinking you already know Indonesia's story, spices, temples, and colonization, right? But what if I told you Indonesia once ruled oceans, controlled global trade, and humbled powerful kings long before Europe even arrived? Beneath this beautiful surface lies a history so intense and so powerful that it helped shape the modern world, yet most people were never taught it. Today we're uncovering Indonesia's hidden history, mighty empires, brutal colonization, and one of the most inspiring fights for freedom ever recorded. Stay with me, because after this you'll never see Indonesia the same way again. Long before foreign flags were planted on Indonesian soil, and long before European maps even accurately showed Southeast Asia, the islands that now form Indonesia were already at the center of the world. These were not quiet, disconnected lands waiting to be discovered. They were alive with movement, power, and purpose. Indonesian waters were among the busiest trade routes on Earth, carrying wealth, ideas, and culture across vast distances. Sailors from the archipelago mastered the sea generations before Western navigation reached similar levels, building ships strong enough to cross open oceans and navigate unpredictable monsoon winds. The sea was not feared here. It was understood, respected, and used as a tool of influence. This maritime mastery became the foundation of Indonesia's early global power. At the heart of this dominance was trade, and Indonesia was perfectly positioned to control it. Located between China and India, two of the world's greatest civilizations, the archipelago became an unavoidable gateway for merchants traveling between East and West. Chinese silk, Indian textiles, Middle Eastern goods, and Indonesian spices all passed through these islands. Whoever controlled these waters controlled global commerce, and Indonesian kingdoms understood this truth deeply. They didn't rely on brute force alone. Instead, they built strategic ports, forged diplomatic alliances, and used economic intelligence to their advantage. Power flowed not from massive land armies, but from command of the sea lanes that connected the world. One of the most influential empires of this era was Srivijaya, a maritime kingdom based in Sumatra that rose around the 7th century. Srivijaya did not expand by conquering vast territories inland. It expanded by dominating choke points like the Strait of Malacca, ensuring that ships had no choice but to pass through its sphere of influence. By controlling these narrow waterways, Srivijaya dictated trade terms, collected taxes, and ensured its dominance without constant warfare. Wealth poured in, and with it came knowledge, religious influence, and prestige. Buddhist monks traveled through Srivijaya's ports on their way between India and China, turning the empire into an intellectual and spiritual hub, as well as an economic one. Chinese records from the Tang and Song dynasties describe Srivijaya with admiration, noting its power, sophistication, and control over regional trade. These were not exaggerated legends passed down orally, but official historical documents acknowledging Indonesia as a significant global force. Srivijaya sent diplomatic missions to China, exchanged gifts, and participated in an international system of diplomacy that treated it as an equal rather than a peripheral player. This alone challenges the modern misconception that Indonesia's global relevance began only after colonization. In reality, foreign powers once came to Indonesian rulers seeking permission, trade agreements, and protection rather than conquest. As centuries passed, power shifted but never disappeared. The Majapahit Empire emerged in the late 13th century and pushed Indonesian influence even further. At its height, Majapahit projected power across much of Southeast Asia, influencing regions that now belong to modern Malaysia, Thailand, Cambodia, and the Philippines. This was not merely territorial expansion, but cultural and political leadership. Majapahit promoted a vision of unity across the islands, an idea that would later inspire Indonesia's modern national motto of unity in diversity. Trade thrived under its rule, law and administration developed, and art, literature, and architecture reached remarkable levels of sophistication. Majapahit's strength lay not only in military capacity, but in organization and vision. The empire understood governance. It balanced regional autonomy with centralized authority, allowing local leaders to maintain traditions while contributing to a larger shared identity. This system created stability across vast distances in an era without modern communication, proving just how advanced Indonesian political thought had become. The empire's influence was strong enough that its legacy still holds emotional and symbolic power in Indonesia today, serving as a reminder that unity across diversity is not a modern concept but an ancient one. These early Indonesian empires were never isolated or stagnant. They adapted constantly, absorbing influences while maintaining their core identity. When Hinduism and Buddhism arrived through trade and scholarship, they were integrated into local culture rather than imposed. Temples like Borobudur and Prambanan stand today as physical proof of Indonesia's ability to transform foreign ideas into something uniquely its own. This adaptability later continued with the arrival of Islam, which spread through trade and teaching rather than conquest. Indonesian societies blended new beliefs with existing customs, creating a form of cultural continuity that strengthened rather than weakened social cohesion. What made Indonesia truly powerful during this era was not just wealth or military reach, but confidence. These societies knew their value. They understood their strategic importance and negotiated from positions of strength. They chose diplomacy when it benefited them and force when necessary. They were not passive players in global history, but active architects of it. European arrival did not mark Indonesia's entry into world affairs. It marked a challenge to an already established system of power that had existed for centuries. When modern audiences look back at history, it is easy to mistake silence for absence. Just because Western textbooks focused elsewhere does not mean Indonesian power did not exist. It thrived, influenced, and shaped international trade routes long before colonization rewrote the narrative. Understanding this past is essential because it restores balance to history. It reminds us that domination is not destiny, and that regions often labeled as underdeveloped once stood at the very center of human civilization, innovation, and global exchange, long before spices became something you casually reach for in your kitchen. They were among the most valuable resources on the planet, capable of shaping destinies, collapsing empires, and fueling unimaginable cruelty. For centuries, spices were not just about flavor. They were about survival, health, wealth, and power. In a world without refrigeration, spices preserved food. In a world where medicine was limited, they were believed to cure illness and even ward off death. In royal courts across Europe, spices symbolized status and authority. And at the center of this global obsession was Indonesia, a place where nature itself produced the treasures everyone else desperately wanted. Indonesia's islands were the only places on Earth where some of the most prized spices grew naturally. Nutmeg, cloves, and mace thrived in the volcanic soil of the Maluku Islands, often called the Spice Islands. These spices could not be grown elsewhere at the time, which made Indonesia not just important but indispensable. A small sack of nutmeg could be traded for land, castles, or fortunes in Europe. This extreme value transformed Indonesian soil into a battlefield long before guns were fired. Control over spices meant control over markets, wealth, and global influence. For centuries, Indonesians managed this trade themselves. Local rulers regulated spice production, trade routes, and foreign access. Spices moved from village farmers to regional ports, then outward to international traders from Arabia, China, and India. This system benefited local communities and reinforced Indonesia's role as a respected center of commerce. Wealth flowed into the region, supporting cities, art, education, and political stability. Trade relationships were built on negotiation and mutual interest, not domination. Indonesia was not exploited during this period. It was empowered by spice trade. Everything changed when Europe entered the picture. European nations were late to the spice trade and deeply frustrated by their dependence on Middle Eastern and Asian intermediaries. Every layer between them and the source increased price and reduced control. This frustration turned into obsession. European powers no longer wanted to trade for spices, they wanted to own them. They wanted monopoly, and monopoly required violence. When Portuguese ships reached Indonesian waters in the 16th century, they arrived armed, aggressive, and unwilling to play by the existing rules of trade. The Portuguese were soon followed by the Dutch, whose approach was even more calculated and ruthless. The Dutch East India Company was created not simply to trade but to dominate. Backed by military force and granted extraordinary legal powers, the company aimed to eliminate all competition and control spice production entirely. Indonesian farmers were ordered to sell only to the Dutch at fixed prices. Independent trade was punished. Resistance was met with terror. Villages were destroyed to prevent overproduction and maintain artificial scarcity, ensuring higher prices in Europe. One of the darkest examples of this brutality occurred in the Banda Islands, the world's only source of nutmeg at the time. When the Bandanese refused to submit to Dutch monopoly, the response was horrifying. Large portions of the population were killed, exiled, or enslaved. The islands were repopulated with enslaved laborers working under Dutch control. All of this happened not because of ideology or religion, but because of spice. A seasoning became the excuse for genocide. Indonesian lives were treated as expendable obstacles in the pursuit of profit. Spices did not just bring violence, they rewrote global power structures. European wealth surged on the backs of Indonesian resources. Profits from spice trade funded wars, industrial expansion, and colonial empires. Meanwhile, Indonesia's economy was systematically stripped of its independence. Local industries collapsed. Traditional trade networks were dismantled. Wealth that once circulated within the region was redirected outward, leaving communities impoverished despite producing some of the world's most valuable goods. This economic distortion would haunt Indonesia for centuries. What makes this history especially tragic is that it was hidden behind language like trade, civilization, and progress. European narratives framed domination as development, even as Indonesian farmers starved and ancient systems were destroyed. Spices became symbols of luxury in Europe, disconnected from the suffering that produced them. A wealthy European household seasoning its food had no idea that the flavor on their plate came at the cost of blood and displacement thousands of miles away. Yet even as spice-driven exploitation reshaped Indonesia's fate, it also revealed something powerful. It showed the immense value of Indonesian land, labor, and knowledge. It revealed that the archipelago was never poor or backward, but so rich that it attracted the most aggressive forces on Earth. The tragedy was not that Indonesia lacked resources, but that those resources were taken by force. Understanding this truth reframes history, shifting blame away from the colonized and onto the systems of exploitation that benefited others. The legacy of the spice trade still lingers today in global inequalities, economic structures, and even modern trade practices. But it also lives on in Indonesia's collective memory as a symbol of both loss and resilience. Spices changed Indonesia's fate by turning its natural abundance into a curse that invited centuries of suffering. Yet they also prove that Indonesia mattered profoundly to the world, long before modern nations rose or fell, long before independence was declared, and long before history tried to forget the true cost of global luxury colonization in Indonesia was not an accidental consequence of contact or aid. Misunderstanding between cultures, it was a deliberate, carefully planned system designed to extract maximum profit while giving back as little as possible. When European powers gained control, they did not arrive with intentions of partnership or coexistence. They arrived with strategies, weapons, and laws engineered to dominate every aspect of Indonesian life. The land, the people, the economy, and even the future were reorganized to serve colonial interests, turning what was once a thriving center of global trade into a controlled machine for foreign benefit. The Dutch East India Company became the main instrument of this system, and its power went far beyond commerce. It could raise armies, declare wars, execute local leaders, and decide the fate of entire populations. Indonesian rulers who resisted were labeled as rebels, stripped of authority, or eliminated entirely. Traditional systems of governance were replaced with colonial administration that favored obedience over justice. Local leaders were often forced into collaboration, becoming tools of oppression against their own people. This manipulation created deep social fractures that lasted long after colonial rule formally ended. One of the most destructive aspects of colonization was economic control. Indonesian farmers were no longer free to choose what they grew or who they sold to. Under forced cultivation systems, villages were ordered to dedicate large portions of their land to export crops such as coffee, sugar, and spices, regardless of local needs. Food crops were neglected, leading to shortages and famine. While European markets flourished, Indonesian communities suffered hunger on land that had once sustained them comfortably. This was not poor management, it was intentional prioritization of profit over human life. Labor under colonial rule was brutal and relentless. Forced labor programs compelled Indonesians to work on plantations, roads, and infrastructure projects without fair pay or humane conditions. Families were separated. Long hours, disease, and exhaustion became normal parts of life. Those who resisted faced punishment, imprisonment, or death. Colonial infrastructure that is sometimes praised today was built on the suffering of countless unnamed laborers whose lives were considered expendable. Progress for the colonizer meant pain for the colonized. Education was also tightly controlled, and this control was strategic. Access to learning was restricted to a small elite class that could serve colonial administration. The vast majority of Indonesians were deliberately kept uneducated to prevent critical thinking, organization, and resistance. History was rewritten to minimize indigenous achievements and portray European rule as necessary and superior. This psychological control was as damaging as physical violence, slowly eroding confidence and reshaping identity. Violence was never far from the surface. Whenever resistance grew too strong, colonial forces responded with overwhelming force. Villages were burned, populations displaced, and leaders executed as warnings to others. These were not isolated incidents, but repeated patterns across the archipelago. From Java to Aceh to Bali, resistance was met with massacres that left deep scars on collective memory. Colonization survived not because it was accepted, but because it was enforced through fear and destruction. What made colonialism especially devastating was its long-term impact. By restructuring the economy to serve external markets, Indonesia was left vulnerable and dependent. Indigenous industries collapsed, traditional skills lost value, and economic independence was stripped away. Even after formal colonization ended, these distorted systems did not disappear overnight. Inequality, land disputes, and economic imbalance can still be traced back to colonial policies implemented generations earlier, yet despite this systematic oppression, colonization never fully succeeded in breaking the Indonesian spirit. Resistance continued in countless forms, sometimes openly through rebellion, sometimes quietly through cultural preservation, language, tradition, and faith. Communities adapted without surrendering their identity. Stories of defiance were passed down, keeping memory alive even when history books tried to erase it. The fact that colonizers needed constant enforcement proves that control was never complete. Understanding the brutality and structure of colonization is essential because it corrects the myth that colonial rule brought progress to Indonesia. Any development that occurred was designed for extraction, not empowerment. Roads led to ports, not schools. Wealth flowed outward, not inward. Stability was maintained through violence, not consent. Colonization was not a chapter of shared growth. It was a system of exploitation that reshaped Indonesia by force. Recognizing this truth does not dwell on victimhood. It restores clarity. It explains why resistance was inevitable, why independence was necessary, and why freedom carried such deep meaning. Indonesia did not emerge from colonization weak or broken, but hardened, aware, and determined. The brutality endured created a collective understanding that dignity could not be given by an empire, only reclaimed by the people themselves. Resistance in Indonesia was never a single moment or one heroic uprising. It was a continuous current that ran beneath the surface of colonial rule from the very beginning. Even as foreign powers claimed authority and raised flags over ports and cities, ordinary people across the archipelago refused to accept domination as permanent. Resistance lived in many forms, sometimes loud and violent, sometimes quiet and deeply personal, but it was always present. This ongoing defiance is what kept the idea of freedom alive through centuries of occupation. In the earliest years of colonization, resistance often emerged from local leaders defending their lands and traditions. Kings, sultans, and regional rulers fought to protect sovereignty, launching armed struggles against better-equipped European forces. Although many of these early rebellions were eventually crushed, their significance went far beyond immediate outcomes. Each uprising challenged the illusion of colonial authority and reminded communities that foreign rule was imposed, not natural or legitimate. Even in defeat, these movements strengthened collective memory and inspired future generations to resist. As colonial control tightened, resistance adapted. When open warfare became impossible, Indonesians found subtler ways to push back. Cultural traditions were preserved as acts of defiance. Languages, rituals, and beliefs were passed down intentionally, protecting identity against forced assimilation. Farmers resisted by hiding crops, refusing to meet production quotas, or sabotaging systems that exploited their labor. These small, everyday acts may not appear dramatic in history books, but they required immense courage and carried real risks. Religion also became a powerful source of resistance. Islamic scholars, village leaders, and community teachers played a central role in keeping morale and unity alive. Religious gatherings offered spaces for discussion, education, and organization beyond colonial surveillance. Faith reinforced the belief that oppression was temporary and that justice would ultimately prevail. In many regions, spiritual authority provided a counterbalance to colonial power, offering people a sense of dignity and hope in times of suffering. Over time, resistance evolved from regional struggles into something more unified. The late 19th and early 20th centuries marked a turning point when Indonesians began to see beyond local identities and recognize a shared fate. This shift was revolutionary. Colonial powers relied heavily on division, separating people by island, ethnicity, and class. The realization that these differences could be overcome became a powerful weapon. Students, intellectuals, and activists started forming organizations that spoke not only of local grievances, but of national freedom. Education, limited as it was, played an unexpected role in this transformation. A small number of Indonesians who gained access to Western education used it not to support colonial rule, but to challenge it. They learned the language of law, politics, and philosophy, then turned those tools against the system that tried to control them. Newspapers, essays, and speeches began to circulate ideas of self-determination, equality, and national identity. Words became weapons, and ideas spread faster than armies. The concept of Indonesia as one nation gradually took shape through shared suffering and shared hope. Young people from different regions came together, setting aside local rivalries to focus on a larger purpose. This unity did not erase diversity, it embraced it. The idea that strength came from many cultures standing together became the moral foundation of the independence movement. It was a vision born directly from resistance, shaped by the understanding that freedom would only come through solidarity. World War II intensified these dynamics. The Japanese occupation removed Dutch power but replaced it with a different form of brutality. Forced labor, hunger, and violence defined everyday life. Yet this period also exposed the weakness of European dominance and showed Indonesians that colonial rulers were not invincible. Underground networks formed, leaders organized, and military experience was gained. Resistance sharpened, becoming more strategic and more confident. When the moment finally arrived to declare independence, it was not spontaneous or reckless. It was the result of centuries of resistance layered upon one another. Every rebellion, every act of defiance, every whispered story of injustice contributed to that courage. Even when independence was challenged by returning colonial forces, the will to resist did not fade. Civilians, fighters, and leaders alike accepted sacrifice as the price of freedom. What makes Indonesia's resistance remarkable is not just that it succeeded, but that it endured. It survived military defeat, economic hardship, political division, and attempts at erasure. Resistance was not confined to battlefields. It lived in homes, schools, mosques, and markets. It was carried in memory, identity, and belief. The colonizers controlled territory, but they never fully controlled the spirit of the people. This continuous resistance shaped the character of the nation that eventually emerged. It fostered resilience, adaptability, and a deep commitment to unity. Freedom was not won through a single decisive event, but through persistence across generations. Indonesia's independence stands as proof that domination can be resisted, that identity can survive under pressure, and that the human desire for freedom cannot be extinguished. Only delayed, Indonesia's independence was not a gift from any foreign power, nor was it the result of a single dramatic moment. It was the culmination of centuries of endurance, sacrifice, and unity forged through shared suffering. The path to freedom was long, uneven, and filled with moments of despair, but it was held together by an unwavering belief that a nation built from many islands, cultures, and languages could stand as one. This unity did not exist automatically. It was built piece by piece in villages, schools, places of worship, and hidden meeting rooms where ordinary people made extraordinary commitments to a dream larger than themselves. By the early 20th century, the idea of Indonesia as one nation began to crystallize. This idea was revolutionary because it challenged the colonial strategy of division. For centuries, the colonizers had relied on keeping the islands separate, encouraging local rivalries, and portraying unity as impossible. But the more Indonesians experienced oppression, the clearer it became that their struggles were shared. Farmers in Java, fishermen in Sulawesi, traders in Sumatra, and teachers in Kalimantan faced the same burdens imposed by foreign rule. The realization that their pain had the same source created a powerful sense of collective identity. National consciousness was not born in textbooks. It emerged from lived experience, and the recognition of common injustice. Youth movements played a crucial role in transforming this shared awareness into organized action. Young Indonesians who had studied abroad or gained access to limited colonial education returned with new ideas about nationalism, democracy, and independence. They did not abandon their cultural roots, but they used modern tools to express their aspirations. Organizations formed in cities across the archipelago began spreading messages of unity and resistance. These groups created networks that transcended regional boundaries, laying the groundwork for a national movement. Their energy and idealism injected new momentum into the struggle, transforming resistance from fragmented and reactive into deliberate and coordinated. This transformation was not confined to educated elites. It spread to villages where parents told their children stories about injustice, where teachers encouraged pride in local culture, and where communities preserved traditions that colonizers tried to erase. Even daily acts of resilience became part of the movement. People continued speaking their languages, practicing their customs, and teaching their history despite pressure to assimilate. Every choice to hold on to identity was a contribution to the eventual drive for freedom. Unity grew not by rejecting diversity, but by embracing it, viewing every culture as a thread strengthening the fabric of a shared future. The Japanese occupation during World War II complicated the story further. It brought new layers of suffering, but it also disrupted the illusion of European superiority. Indonesians witnessed colonial powers being defeated, and this deeply altered perceptions of what was possible. The occupation forced Indonesia into extreme hardship, yet it also opened doors for political training, military organization, and administrative experience that had been denied under Dutch rule. Leaders who would later guide the independence movement learned how to mobilize people, coordinate efforts, and navigate complex power structures. It was a painful period, but one that sharpened the tools that would be used to claim freedom when the time finally came in 1945 to declare independence. It was not an impulsive act. It was a deliberate and courageous decision taken in a moment of uncertainty. Indonesia was emerging from the devastation of war, and the future was unclear. Yet leaders like Sukarno and Hatta understood that waiting would only invite recolonization. They seized the moment, knowing that their declaration was not simply a political move, but the fulfillment of a promise carried by generations before them. Their voices represented millions who had resisted in silence, who had suffered without recognition, and who had held on to hope despite overwhelming odds. Independence did not instantly bring peace. When the Dutch attempted to reclaim control, Indonesians responded with determination and unity unlike anything the colonizers had expected. Farmers, students, workers, intellectuals, religious leaders, and fighters all took part in defending the new nation. Villages provided food and shelter to fighters. Youth volunteered as couriers and scouts. Women played crucial roles in organizing supplies, spreading information, and preserving morale. The fight was not just on battlefields, it was woven into daily life. Everyone became a guardian of independence. This collective effort revealed something profound about Indonesia's national character. Freedom was not pursued for personal gain or political prestige. It was embraced as a shared responsibility. The willingness to sacrifice came from the understanding that independence meant dignity, self-respect, and the right to shape one's own future. It was a belief that no external power should decide the fate of the archipelago or the identity of its people. Unity became the foundation that upheld this belief, proving stronger than differences in language, religion, or region. What makes Indonesia's fight for independence remarkable is not just the final victory, but the moral strength that carried the struggle. Colonial powers underestimated this strength because they measured power in guns and wealth. Indonesians measured it in resilience, loyalty, and the unbreakable desire to reclaim what had been stolen. Even when suffering seemed endless, the people refused to surrender their vision of a free and united nation. Generations passed this determination forward like a torch, ensuring that the flame of freedom would not be extinguished when independence finally took hold. It symbolized much more than the end of colonial rule. It represented the triumph of unity over division, courage over fear, and persistence over oppression. It showed the world that freedom is not something granted by an empire. It is something earned through struggle, sacrifice, and belief. Indonesia's journey proves that even the most powerful systems of domination can be dismantled when people choose to stand together. And it reminds us that the strength of a nation is not measured by the size of its territory or the wealth of its resources, but by the spirit of its people and their willingness to defend their dignity at any cost.